Welcome to another video from the Fisherman's Net and Saints Peter and Paul in Naperville, Illinois. In this new series of videos, we're going to look at the question of how we come to know God, or know about God. This is the question, how can our finite, limited human minds know anything about the infinite, transcendent God? It's the question of divine revelation. How has God told us about himself? And we'll see by the end that we know God most because he's revealed himself by becoming one of us in the person of Jesus Christ. But before we get to the end, we can start at the beginning and notice that there are two orders of knowledge here. And the first order of knowledge is just our human reason alone. And the Catholic Church teaches that with our unaided human reason alone, just by thinking about things, we can come to a knowledge that God exists with certainty. We can know with certainty, just by our human minds, that there is a God. And we can know certain attributes of God, things like his infinity, and his unchangeableness, and his goodness, and his all-powerfulness. These different attributes of God flow from some of the different arguments for God's existence. This idea that we can come to know God by unaided human reason goes all the way back to Greek philosophy, where hundreds of years before the time of Christ, philosophers like Aristotle argued to an unmoved mover, a first principle of change in the universe. Now, Aristotle didn't understand the Christian God, the Trinity, that God is love, but he reasoned from things around us that there must be a first cause of it all, an uncaused cause, an unmoved mover. These are lines of thought that Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century would develop into his so-called 5 ways for coming to know the existence of God. But again, this idea that we can come to know the existence of God with our rational minds alone is actually found in the Scriptures. St. Paul, in St. Paul's letter to the Romans, he says in chapter 1, starting at verse 20, "Ever since the creation of the world, his invisible nature," that is, God's invisible nature, namely his eternal power and deity, has been clearly perceived in the things that have been made. So St. Paul is saying that we can look at the world around us, and through things that are made, come to know the existence of God, his power and his deity, that he's God. Right? So this is kind of like reasoning from an effect back to a cause. We have no direct sense input about God. We can't taste, touch, see, smell God. But from his effects in the world, we can reason through philosophy back to a cause. It's much like if I stumbled upon a beautiful painting in a forest, my mind would reason to the fact that there was a painter and someone placed it there. Well, we can look at certain attributes of creation and reason back to a cause, a first cause that we call God. And we can actually look at two different things. There's two different ways of coming to know God. The first is by looking at the world around us. We can look at the world around us, things like cause and effect, things like change, things like the differences of perfection in things like the order of the universe. And from those things, we're able to reason back to a first cause, a first mover, a most perfect being, these kinds of things. Now, to follow any one of these lines of reasoning would take too long right now. It would be out of the scope of this video. But this is one way we can come to know the existence of God, is by looking at the world around us. The other way we can come to know the existence of God is by looking within ourselves, looking at the human person. Of course, Revelation tells us in the book of Genesis that humans are created in the image and likeness of God. And so if that's true, we would think that among all of creation there would be something unique within us that reflects God. And so we can look at things like our moral sense, that we all have built into us, it seems, a moral law that we don't acquire, that we can't override or disregard, and a moral law suggests a moral lawgiver. We can also simply look at our desire for things like truth, goodness, and beauty, that these desires we have for things more transcendent, those desires are infinite. There's no one day where I'm going to wake up and say, I don't need to be loved anymore. I'm good. I've had enough goodness. No, we have what seems like an insatiable appetite for things like love and good and truth and beauty. And that points to something that can actually fulfill those desires, something that is infinite love, infinite truth, infinite goodness, infinite beauty. If that wasn't the case, it would be like we were born thirsty with no possibility of finding water. It turns out that all of our natural desires have an object to them. We have a natural desire of hunger, and there happens to be food. We have a natural desire for breathing, and there happens to be air. We all have this natural desire for apparently an infinite truth, good, and beauty that only one thing could satisfy, and that would be a transcendent being. So again, we can look inside of ourselves, we can look at the world for an understanding that there is a God. Now, our Christian faith tells us, though, that these proofs, if you will, for the existence of God, not everyone has the leisure to follow them through, or the time. Not everyone has the intellectual capacity necessarily to follow these philosophical arguments. And even when people do, they're admixed with error. So because of this, not only can our human minds reason to God, but God has also chosen to reveal himself. This is very important, I should say, because the understanding of God from these arguments or from this reasoning is only a very thin slice of the Christian God. Our reasoning might be able to tell us that there is a being who's intelligent and powerful, who's good and all-powerful, but that's not the Christian God. This reasoning tells us nothing about God as Trinity, God as love, a God who has a plan of salvation for us. For these things, our reason is inadequate. Those things had to be communicated by God himself. They had to be revealed to us. And that's the second order of knowledge. This video we talked about the first order of knowledge, or human reason. In upcoming videos we'll talk about this higher order of knowledge, where we know God because he has spoken to us. He's revealed himself to us. So we'll look at that more in some upcoming videos.